Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence. Today, we're going to look at the second part of an introduction to identity governance. So what are you going to learn today? We're going to talk about the importance of authorization in the identity process. We're going to take a look at a few of the principles of authorization, and we're going to do an overview of authentication and look at some of the relevant authentication attacks and password controls related to authentication. So the agenda, we're going to cover authorization, authentication, and touch briefly on Cyvergence services. So housekeeping. So this is a second part of an ongoing series. It's not intended to be a complete overview. Even with this one, it's not going to be complete, but I do recommend going back and seeing the first part because it does tie into some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and jump into authorization. So there's a lot of different types of authorization. So there's new hires. You've got permanent employees or temporary employees, depending on what you're doing for the organization. And this is important. This is authorized combination of by human resources because you've gone through and had the background checks, or sometimes by the hiring manager, depending on the organization. There's a lot of ways that companies can structure things, and sometimes that doesn't matter as long as there's a process that's going on and the appropriate people are getting the buy-in to hire the temporary or permanent employees, depending on the context. But sometimes with accounts, you're looking also at the IT authors doing the authorization, especially with IT workers. They're going to have the standard accounts, what I'm referring to as basic here, accounts that they should use to log into systems. But in a well-oiled machine, typically you're going to have an account that's administrative that is separate from the basic account. And part of the reason is you don't want somebody to be able to gain access to administrative controls from a local machine if you're connecting in. So, for example, if a hacker gets into a machine because you're surfing the web or you have to get into something, they're going to have access of the user that accessed the machine at that time. So if you had an administrative account, they would have full control of the machine. So it's going to be limited by having a basic account. And usually what administrators do is they're going to log in via SSH or, in worst cases, Telnet or some other things, or RDP if it's a Windows environment. This is how they're going to go ahead and access things. So that account is going to be separate. The only cases you're going to run into is if there's a keystroke logger and it's going to start to catch in. Now, this is very basic that we're covering. I'm not going to cover all things related to things. So just keep in mind that there are a lot of other designations that may be appropriate for your organization that I'm not going to talk about today. There's also service accounts. For those who are not familiar with service accounts, this is an account that is different from the administrative level account that is used to accomplish goals on the back end of an organization. That's all part of an automation process. But then you have local accounts. These are things like administrative accounts on a machine, which is different than, say, a domain account, which was what I was talking about before. So the difference is when you're logging in, are you logging in with a domain account or a local account? And that can make all the difference in the world. For the Linux systems, you're going to find something like sudo, sometimes referred to as sudoers file, where they're able to go in and gain access to it on an administrative level once they've logged into a machine. And so that way you'd limit a certain number of accounts to access machines in that fashion. And of course, there's other types of authorizations that are going on. These are contractors, vendors, and consultants. And the processes are very important to consider because who's doing the authorization of the accounts. And so ultimately what this is going to tie into is what's a source of truth for determining identity across organizations. And this is going to become very important later on down the road, especially as you do assessments within organizations. But of course, there's a few principles as well when you're deciding, because you have to look at the level of access they have, and we're going to cover more in a future episode as well. But know the principle of least privilege. Now, this has been around for, I don't even know the number of years, but more than 20 years, this has been around where you give them the least amount of access that they need to do their job. And so they don't have additional. So a standard user should not have full administrative access to environment if they don't need that. You don't have the finance department gaining access to human resources and vice versa. There's a lot of examples where the principle of least privilege makes perfect sense. Another topic that's really important is separation of duties. That is a very founding principle within cybersecurity that also has been around for a long time. Originally, it came in from the banking industry. And sometimes it's referred to as segregation of duties as well. But basically, you need two people to accomplish a goal to create a better environment. The Probably the most important, depending on the organization, of course, is developers having access to production. From a compliance standpoint, that is almost mandated that you have separation of duties in place. And the reason why they're doing the development, you don't want them necessarily gaining access to production. Now, when I've worked in a lot of different types of environments, as some of you may be aware, and almost always when you're trying to go up the chain of the command, and usually many IT leaders don't want to do it because it's a real strain to get this work done, is what they will do is say, no, we don't want that. But then I go up the chain of command, whether I'm dealing with different parts of the government, et cetera, always there's been problems with the developers having access to production. So that's a really big one that has to be paid attention to in most compliance environments, especially not for like the tiny businesses or small businesses where this is not applicable, but it's just something to consider. Another topic that's out there that's been around a few years, but does jump off of some of the things like least privilege is zero trust. Zero trust is a game changer. It's also much larger than just identity, but ties into identity across the board. You can look at this for those who are familiar with the concept of microsegmentation. That's part of it. But in this particular case, trying to get zero trust down to the level of access that's required or does include some of the principles of least privilege, but takes it to a next level is another important concept. Principle. Now, the just-in-time access is another part of zero trust too. So all of these things are taking a look at the big picture of zero trust, and it will be a topic of conversation at a later time because I am very briefly skimming the surface of what it is, just talking about that these are some principles that might be included in terms of zero trust. But let's go ahead and do a deeper dive now into authentication. So obviously there's a lot of applicability here. When you're looking at most enterprise environments, you might consider things like mobile devices. Desktops and laptops can be part of that. Servers, might have websites or different applications or local applications, individual servers or cloud environments, physical access, IoT devices, VPN, all of these things are taking a look at authentication. How is authentication set up for your organization and what makes sense from that perspective? So this is getting down to the individual systems, including some of the cloud applications as part of that process. The other side of it is accounts. What are the different types of accounts? And there can be hundreds and hundreds depending on the types of application, but you might have a lot of different types within an organization. And being able to create accountability across the board for those accounts is extraordinarily important, especially when you get into some separation of duties needs that can be talked about ad nauseum for organizations. But there's local accounts. These are the pre-built accounts within a system. In many organizations, they remove those accounts entirely. In some cases, that's not true. They have them there as a backup account. But then you have directory accounts. These are the ones that, kind of at higher levels. So you have a system, and then you have a directory account. So in the Windows world, you're either going to have Active Directory, Azure AD was the other name, but now it's called Entra. So in the Windows world, that's kind of at the cloud level, which is a little different than the basic level that I'm talking about today. Then, of course, in the Linux world, you have something called Open LDAP, which is their equivalent of Active Directory. There are some nuances that I'm not going to go into today. The idea is just to understand where that comes in. But of course, you've got applications, and that's another part of the whole process because you could have hundreds or thousands of applications, or maybe one or two, depending on the size of your organization. So when you're looking at the applicability of authentication, that's an important thing to consider. But let's also dive into passwords because you can't get away from passwords these days. There's a lot of movement to move away from passwords, so I'm not going to go too far into this. But it's good to understand why passwords are so important and what actually goes on with different types of attacks. In part one, I was discussing just how important passwords are today as a result of what's going on. So what happens is a lot of people end up reusing passwords across multiple sites and sometimes within their own organization. So you've got to plan for that. How do you handle that within your organization? So you come up with things like, password complexity, password rotation. There's a bunch of things we're going to go into in a little bit, but there's reuse of harvested password is something that attackers do. You can also do things like brute force attacks. And I talked about that last time, but those brute force attacks mean that they're just going and trying the password over and over, trying new passwords over and over and over again in order to see if they can get past the common controls. So this is just throwing whatever they can. And so there are means of stopping that, but that's part of it. Another thing to do is throw the dictionary at you. They're just going to try some different dictionary words that are out there that people would typically use, or even some of the basics. It might look up the address. Some people might say, I work at 1 Broadway, and then they put 1 Broadway as a password. And if it's complexity, you might put something in there. That's not good complexity, however. So they'll use some of the dictionaries or common themes that they'll see for organizations to see if it's complex, if they can gain access as appropriate to the organization. Of course, there's things like adversary in the middle. Old school was man in the middle attacks, but these are people who are in. So it's important to protect the communication between a web server and something else, because they could gain access. So if they're in the middle of that and you have things going over plain text protocol, an attacker, if they gain access to that, could see what the username and password is and then compromise the account that way. So it's really important to have encryption in place, just because it can create so many different issues. There's keystroke logging. These are other types of things. I think I'd mentioned that very briefly, where you get a piece of malware which captures all of your passwords and tries to protect you that way. So a standard user, however, if they're typing in their password, say in a motel or hotel kiosk somewhere, well, you might need to change your password as soon as you get home. It's just an intelligent thing to do. So keystroke loggers are a big problem today. Sometimes they're caught, sometimes they're not. Depends on the type of antivirus that you're working with. Of course, there's phishing. They'll send you a phishing email, you click on something, and then they'll put up a farming site. And a farming site is something that looks like it's something you're trying to go to, but it's actually not. And you click on it and you get things compromised. There are also voice phishing. This is where they do social engineering, like, hi, I'm part of the IT department. And they may or may not be part of the IT department. And they will try to ask you for your username and password. So social engineering is also a big part of the password attacks for organizations. There's shoulder surfing, somebody looking over your shoulder as you're working. And this is, the nefarious insider that's trying to do something. They're going to take a look at the keyboard and say, oh, I've got your username and password now. And they're going to use that to access your account. There's also desk searching, where people look through. A lot of times people write down their username and passwords and put a sticky note or put it underneath something so they can just figure out what their password is for that particular day. So that's very common too. And of course, there's password cracking. Just because you've got something in Windows, it can be cracked because they use a salted and hashed file to be able to store that information in. And it's going to depend on several different factors, but that's part of that whole process when you're looking at the password attacks. So a lot of times in organizations, there's these password controls. They may seem really annoying for a lot of people. The security professionals love having them in place. But you've got password complexity, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 special character, 1 number, things that all of us have seen and heard before. Having a reasonable length on a password. If you have an 8-character password, it can be compromised pretty quickly. You go up to a 15-character password, it is much more difficult to crack. So having that in place is a huge win. Password rotation. So if a password's compromised, you rotate the password, then if the attacker has that password, then the password's going to be rotated and they won't be able to gain access again. So rotating that password on a pretty regular basis is important. There's password reuse prevention. So you prevent the passwords, and usually you put up, like if you talk about the government requirements, it's up to 24 passwords that you're remembering, that it cannot reuse it. And then you limit the number of days, because if you limit the number of days before they can change the password, that's going to prevent them from just rotating their password very quickly. Or at least if you have 24 rotations and they're changing their password all the time, then that's going to prevent that. In some organizations, and I've seen this before with people, they will sit there and they will just change their password over and over and over again to get their same password again in order to go forward, because they like their old password. So some of these minimum day controls make perfect sense. They're there for a reason, because we've all witnessed these types of things who've been in information security for a period of time. Eliminate local storage of passwords. That can be troublesome in many cases. Like you wouldn't want to do that if you've got a laptop and they're carrying it around on a business meeting. They may not have access to a directory in order to log into the laptop to begin with. So that can be a challenge, but it's something you can do within Windows or other systems as well. But just something to consider. Monitoring for the dark web. Has that password been compromised? And so putting systems within Windows and other things to detect the compromised accounts within it can be a huge win because you're reducing the risk. Reducing the risk that an already compromised password is being used. There's different types of password monitoring capabilities too. There are a bunch of tools on the market that are going to be able to monitor from a website if you're trying to log into it to determine if there's going to be an issue or not. So there's a lot going on. There's LEET as well. It's a type of speak, and there are different levels of LEET and that you can go into, but basically it's using characters to create numbers. So instead of an E, you might use the letter 3 or the number 3 to create the word LEET. Instead of an L, you can have a 1. So you might have 133 T, and you can use a number sign rather than a T. So there's lots of variations on this. This is just to give you an idea what LEET speak is, but a lot of people use that because it's a shorthand of them trying to remember what those passwords are. So trying to make sure that you block the dictionary tags. You can upload these into a lot of different types of system dictionaries, and also getting into leak prevention. It's one of the controls for some of the solutions that you can purchase out there. Also, interactive login is important. So I'd mentioned something about service accounts, those accounts that they're going to be using to do other functions. Typically, they don't have interactive logins. They're not logging into a server. They're logging in to accomplish a goal, but they're not trying to log in as a random person would. So disabling interactive login is a very important part of protecting those accounts to make sure that they are going to be doing much less damage to systems than they would otherwise be able to accomplish. But that's a quick overview of the password attacks and the associated controls, just something to consider. We also did not touch, though, on multi-factor authentication. Now, one thing that a lot of people think that multi-factor authentication is a silver bullet. It is not a silver bullet. There are problems with multi-factor authentication. It's very good, and there's different levels of multi-factor authentication. But let's go ahead and talk about what the basics are. So multi-factor authentication is something that you have, something that you know, or something that you are. So for example, you might have a physical token as your second factor. So then you'd have to type in something in order to gain access, or maybe you have access to another phone that's able to do something. Something that you know, that's going to be your classic password. And so when you're looking at that multi-factor, typically it's going to be, okay, I've got to type in an extra number and I'm going to type in the name, and you're going to start logging in that way. But then that's something that you are. That's the other factor of multi-factor. This is going to be your biometric authentication. This is like your face, fingerprints, and things like that. But there's a lot of different forms of MFA that are out there. Some of them are going to send an extra level password via email. There's a short messaging service. So this is a text message going to your phone. There's voice versions of these. There's the hard tokens that I talked about before. You can use a QR code that's going to be on a system. Then you scan it with your phone, and that will allow you to log in. There's all kinds of things that are going on. I mean, the other thing that's kind of happening, it's starting to blur the line and get away from passwords, because that ends up being an issue for a lot of companies, is getting into behavioral-based authentication. So this is a little bit different. It's kind of something that you are, because it's watching your behaviors and your patterns and things like that. But sometimes it takes a bit of time to go through. But I've seen in some of the companies that I've looked at related to the biometric, they're going to have upwards of 80 different controls and things that they're going to monitor from a behavior perspective to make sure that you are who you say that you are. And there's other things like step-up authentication, which I didn't go into from a detail here, but hey, you gain access to this website through this computer. We recognize that computer. We're good to go. But if you're accessing it through another computer, then it might say, we don't recognize who you are. We're going to have you add in multi-factor authentication. So there's a lot of different options. There's identity proofing, and that's where they will go back to some sort of knowledge resource to figure out what you have access to. And it's going to ask you a whole bunch of additional questions. And so that's where identity proofing comes in. That's just an additional level to what you know in addition to a password. But of course, there's certificates as well, TLS certificates. This is where they're going to put a certificate in your browser. So when you connect in, only you can connect in, or only people who have the appropriate certificate can log into that site. And this way, it's going to prevent anybody who doesn't have the certificate from being able to log in. And then sometimes the one-factor authentication is sufficient in order to log into those sites. So these are just a few of the options that are out there. When you're looking at MFA, there's a lot more to it, but it's at least giving you the idea of what some of the authentication options are. Now, there are a lot of authentication extensions. This could be a whole topic of conversation here. I'm going to be very simplistic just for sake of discussion today. Is we're going to go into single sign-on. Single sign-on is if you have a lot of websites within your organization or even external to your organization that you might need multiple companies to log into, and there's a lot of different options with this, but you might use something called single sign-on. In the traditional world, you just go into that website and then you have to have another password, username and password, and you log in and try to do something. Well, that's painful. That's a long, painful process. If you need to access 20 different websites per day, have 20 different multi-factor authentication mechanisms to log into a website, it's very easy for you to get confused. Anybody would. That's very normal. So single sign-on is a way to get around that, to make things easier for individuals. So in the end, you can save companies a lot of money by implementing things like single sign-on. The other option is federation, and that can be done between different organizations. And there's a lot that can be said here. This is another one of those really big topics that we could sit down and dive into. But federation is where you start to connect different types of authentication mechanisms. Maybe you can provide username and password, and there's other things that you can extend into that to allow connections into different systems. So what happens in a lot of websites is they'll create a federated environment in the background, or sometimes they'll do like a connection between different authentication mechanisms, say Active Directory or some of these others, to allow the username and password to go through their first organization. So that's part of the federated approach to authentication, but it does save a lot of users problems. So for example, in hospital settings, it is very common for doctors to move from point A to point B. And so if they're able to log in to multiple areas and multiple sites because you've got that in place, that's a huge win because they're going all over the place from an authentication perspective. So there's a lot going on, but at least that's part of it. It's all adding to the authentication extension in order to save users time. So we've covered a lot today. We're not going to go too much further. We're going to go into the divergent services. Of course, there's a whole bunch of things we can do. We can do identity assessments, help you with tools, start to build your programs around identity and cover things. But really what's important, reach out and have a conversation. I'm here to help you. If you need anything, we can go from there. So on that note, I wanted to thank you very much. Feel free to follow us on YouTube and LinkedIn, etc. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for your time. It's greatly appreciated. Bye-bye.